Welcome back to Bible study, everyone, here at Concordia for the series Following to the Cross, Mark chapters 11 through 16. We're on session 9. Today is Palm Sunday. We started this back in chapter 11 with Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And today, chapter 15 of the Gospel according to Mark will be the culmination of so many themes and ideas and teachings about Jesus that all come to conclusion in chapter 15 before we get the resurrection in chapter 16. So, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to cover highlights of the entire chapter 15 today up to the burial to uncover and see how the gospel according to Mark really in this section helps us understand who Jesus is. We'll hear a lot about being a king. We'll hear a lot about political maneuverings with Pilate and titles like King of the Jews. And we'll have one key episode about what it means to follow Jesus as someone is called to pick up their cross and follow Jesus, literally. So, a lot of familiar events in this chapter, I would guess, for those of you participating, you might know much about Pilate and Simon of Cyrene, and of course, the crucifixion itself. So, what I'll do today is hit those highlights, those key themes where Mark is driving home who Jesus is and what he came to do. We left off in chapter 14 with the trial before the Sanhedrin, before the elders in Jerusalem. The elders in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, could not commit someone to death. They could not render a verdict and execute someone by law. So they had to get Pilate into the mix. And here's where we see the political dynamics of the day really come into focus. Pilate, well, let me read the passage. And Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "You have said so," which is, of course, kind of a non answer. The chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now we'll put a marker there on that word amazed because, or sorry, that Jesus was silent and Pilate was amazed at that, because this will come up with reference to Psalm 22, which is echoed throughout this chapter. And we'll see that at the end of the session today. But notice again the political charge that has been brought to Pilate. Are you king of the Jews? Now, just a note, and I won't go into detail here, but just so you understand a little bit of the political dynamics at work here. Judea at this point is under direct control of the emperor, who appoints a prefect to rule in his stead. When Jesus was born, Herod the Great was the ruler. His sons, it didn't work out. Too many problems with the taxes and rebellions and all kinds of things. So Rome ruled this directly. The emperor ruled this directly. And Pilate is appointed in 26 AD as the prefect of this area, Judea and Samaria. Here's a map so you can see what that territory was. Galilee was under different jurisdiction, and the other gospel writers pick up on this difference in other elements of the Passion story, which Mark does not get into. The key point here is Pilate is representing Rome. He's a Gentile, and we've seen already that Jesus predicted that he would be handed over to the Gentiles 3 times. And the charge brought against Jesus is that he is king of the Jews. So a political charge. We do know that Pilate is a historical figure. He's referenced elsewhere. And there's even archaeological evidence of Pilate, which has been discovered. This inscription was found in Caesarea which is Pilate dedicating a building to the emperor. So the inscription, and you can see it's broken off, but it would have said to the divine Augustus, the emperor, this Tiberium Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated. So notice again, divine Augustus, there's the honorific given to the emperor, and Pilate, who is prefect of Judea. So Pilate is being a good Roman citizen. He's dedicated buildings, and he's left a record in the archaeological evidence, interestingly. The charge against Jesus is quite clearly political. The leaders of the temple knew that Pilate would not want to get mixed up in religious debates. He would not see that as something that required capital punishment. And Pilate himself had run-ins with the temple authorities. He did some dumb things that we won't get into here. So again, we know of Pilate from other records and other textual evidence. They bring a political charge against Jesus because they want to get him out of the picture. And Pilate is the only way to do that. So the charge, "Are you king of the Jews?" is a challenge to the position of the emperor. And it puts Pilate in a pretty delicate spot because what they're saying essentially is, as the Sanhedrin, as the Jewish elders, we are loyal to the emperor. And you, Pilate, are you loyal to the emperor? If there is this treasonous individual who is going around with people acclaiming him the son of David, a king, are you going to allow that to stand? Are you really loyal to Caesar? Are you a friend of Caesar, is the phrase used in the other Gospels. So there's games happening here. And this title, even though it's kind of part of the political maneuvering happening, is actually, in a sense, correct. Now, we'll see it's not sufficient, but Mark emphasizes this title again and again and again. We'll see it again in 15:9, 12, 18, 26, and 32. And again, as you recall, one of the issues or questions that Mark is seeking to answer for us and the readers of this gospel is, who is Jesus? Why the title King of the Jews? So, is Caesar the ruler of this area, or is Jesus? That's the charge being put before Pilate. So how does this trial end up? There's this interesting interlude, which I won't read here, but the way it's resolved, you can kind of pause and read it on your own, is this kind of familiar episode of Pilate offering up someone in Jesus' stead. And there is evidence that this was a precedent, or at least something that rulers had the opportunity to do. And Pilate, of course, sees this as something expedient. Now, Pilate knows how to play the game as well as anyone. So he puts up someone who is guilty of insurrection, and he's committed murder. So Pilate's playing the game. If you think you can put me into a political corner, I'm going to put you right back into a political corner. He offers up this Barabbas as an alternative to Jesus, and he's a known insurrectionist, political, and he's a murderer. So he puts it right back. The crowd came back to Pilate and says, "Please do what we asked you to do." Keep in mind the crowd here in Jerusalem at dawn, essentially, are the people connected to the temple. They're not the pilgrims who were on the slopes of the Mount of Olives on Palm Sunday, acclaiming Jesus as king. These are the people who are connected to the temple. And so, as we saw earlier in chapters 11 and 12, they see Jesus as a threat to that entire operation. So Pilate comes back. "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews, right? He's thrown that political football back at them. The chief priests stir up the crowd to have them release Barabbas instead. Pilate, what should I do with the man you call? And by you, he just means all you Jewish people out there. He's not differentiating at this point. The man you call King of the Jews. The response, crucify him. Pilate, why? What evil has he done? They shouted all the more, crucify him. So notice again, this mollifying the crowds comes up. Just like the religious leaders would not arrest Jesus in the temple because they feared the crowds, Pilate now fears the crowds. And again, because he's done stupid things in the past, he knows the really tinderbox that a situation like Jerusalem can be at the time of a major festival. He just wants done with it. Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released them for Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So again, the political dynamics here are kind of everything is a train wreck, right? Everything is a political maneuvering. So people either get what they want or keep themselves out of trouble. And Jesus is just kind of a pawn to all this political maneuvering. At the same time, of course, Jesus has predicted that all this would happen. He is a football, but at the same time, he knows where all this is going and has laid this out ahead of time, as we saw in the three passion predictions in chapters 8, 9, and 10. So it's again another reminder that when Jesus says something is going to happen, it's going to happen. And we can understand this on a kind of political historical level. But what Mark wants us to understand is that Jesus is fulfilling what he said he would do. That's the theological point that's being made. So they lead him away. And again, Mark puts detail in places that we wouldn't necessarily highlight ourselves if we were trying to kind of write out a movie, right, for the last hours of Jesus. He throws in a lot of detail about the scourging. So the soldiers lead him away. They call together, actually, the palace is the word translation here. The word in Greek is praetorion, which is a Latin word, praetorium, which is a military building. It's one of the few places where Mark uses a Latin word to describe something in the gospel, which again is an indication that Mark is writing for a Gentile audience, perhaps even a Roman audience. Be that as it may, they called together the whole cohort. They clothed him in a purple cloak, crown of thorns, began to salute him, Hail, King of the Jews, striking his head, spitting on him, kneeling down in homage to him. Notice no indication here about the prophesying. It's really an emphasis on the mockery and the specific mockery of the claim that Jesus is King of the Jews. The purple cloak, of course, is a sign of royalty. Only a Roman senator could wear purple. So they put a purple cloak on him, they take it back, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Now, the scourging part is actually part of the Roman practice. So when someone would be crucified, oh, sorry, there's a praetorium. Forgot I had that picture there. When someone is led out to be crucified, and we'll get into this in a moment, crucifixion is a form of torturous execution. And the flagellation, you see the flagellum there is the Roman word. Flagellation is the fancy word we use to whip someone, was designed to worsen the punishment as they are hanging on the cross. There's, you see in the photo there, a couple of the iron spikes that would be tied to the end of the leather strips on the flagellum, on the whip. And And the Roman punishment was 40 lashes minus one. So 39 lashes. And this is rough. this is really rough. So not only is it being whipped, it's being whipped with metal spikes. We'll get into what this points to when we get to Psalm 22. So we have the mockery of Jesus, again, fulfilling Jesus' prediction in chapter 8. And again, you should notice that Jesus has done nothing at this point actively. He is passively being led to the cross. In verse 21, we have a very specific and actually very important episode recorded in the gospel. So I want to take a look at this specifically. Verse 21. They compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Notice here's another random character who is just minding his own business and gets swept up into the story and has to respond immediately to the events around Jesus. Notice we get a name. Unlike the widow who puts in the mites, unlike the woman who anoints Jesus for burial, we actually get a name here. Rufus of Cyrene, or Simon of Cyrene, whose sons Alexander and Rufus. Mark probably includes the names because the original readers of Mark's gospel would have known who these people are. They were probably Christians. Now, it doesn't say that specifically, but why else would Mark name them? And we see this in a few places in Mark's gospel. In any event, the theological and discipleship point of this verse is that this person, again, seemingly randomly, actually does what Jesus had said a follower of Jesus should do. So, Mark chapter 8. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. And here is a person who is called literally to pick up a cross and follow Jesus. And what does he do? Well, he picks it up and follows. Again, put this in contrast to the disciples. Jesus told the disciples 3 times that this would happen when they got to Jerusalem. He told them just hours before it happened that they would all flee because of him. And with all this forewarning and all this preparation, they still failed. But here, someone is able to pick up a cross and follow Jesus, even at the risk of his own life. You recall Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And here, this person is made to be someone literally following Jesus and carrying his cross. I have no doubt that this would have been an incredible comfort to the original readers of Mark's gospel, who, as you've mentioned in the past, are probably facing persecution. We know that there was persecution against Christians in local places already in the 60s of the first century. It occurred again in the 90s, and of course, especially in the 3rd century and 4th centuries. But already in the 60s, we know of persecutions of Christians in Rome. And no doubt they were terrified. And some of them had probably failed. Yet here is someone who was able to follow, someone who was able to endure the shame of the cross. I have no doubt this would have been incredibly encouraging to Christians facing this very action themselves. So, Simon picks up the cross and follows, and we get someone else added to the list of faithful followers. And then we get to the cross. The significance of the cross, if you participated in the study on Philippians back in the fall, we talked about this a little bit. The crucifixion was the worst form of punishment that could be administered in the Roman Empire. The Apostle Paul picks up on this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We preach Christ crucified, to the Jews an insurmountable obstacle, a stumbling block is how that's usually translated, but to the Gentiles, like Pilate and the Romans, foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jew and Greek, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. What Paul is reflecting on is the fact that about the dumbest way in the Roman Empire that you could conceive of a savior coming to rescue humanity is to crucify him. That would make absolutely no sense to a Roman. It hardly makes sense in the 21st century. But we've lost a little bit of the scandal, of the horror that crucifixion was in the first century. Even the Torah, the Pentateuch, the book of Deuteronomy, picks up on the horror of crucifixion. So Deuteronomy 21, if a man has committed a crime punishable by death and he is put to death and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. Get that phrase, cursed by God. You shall not defile your land, and the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. Paul picks up on this in Galatians chapter 3. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. So there's theological foolishness to the crucifixion. And that's why the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 talks about crucifixion be a stumbling block to the Jew, an insurmountable obstacle. The foolishness to the Gentile is the other half of it. And we know quite a bit about the method and the suffering inherent in crucifixion from descriptions and even archaeological evidence again. So in 1968, there was a discovery in around Jerusalem of an ossuary. We'll talk more about that with the resurrection. And a criminal, someone was crucified by the Romans, a Jewish person, and he was buried with his family in this ossuary, much the same way that Jesus would have been prepared for burial, as you see at the end of chapter 15. And when they opened up this ossuary, they found this. This is an ankle bone with a spike through it. And if you look closely, let me put this up here, there's a little bit of a piece of wood on the spike end of it. It was tested to be olive wood. So here you have a Jewish person crucified in the first century in exactly the way that the Gospels describe Jesus being crucified. And he's buried in exactly the same way that the women prepared Jesus' body for burial. So it wasn't Jesus. His name was Johanan. His name is on the ossuary. But this is evidence that Roman leaders were perfectly capable of crucifying Jewish people in Jerusalem. A little background on crucifixion by the Romans. It was adopted in the first century BC. Initially, it was not intended to kill someone, only to humiliate them. Of course, the clothes are stripped away, they're hung in a public place, they're naked. I know depictions of the crucifixion will have a strategically placed cloth, but the whole point of this was to humiliate. By the time we get to the first century, this becomes really the ultimate form of execution. At first, crucifixion was only permitted to be carried out on slaves, then foreign captives, rebels, and conquered enemies. We know of mass executions, for example, the Spartacus-led slave rebellion in 71 BC, which actually terrified the city of Rome, resulted in 6,000 crucifixions simultaneously. They lined the roads outside of Rome with crosses to crucify 6,000 rebellious slaves. There were 2,000 Jews crucified by Quintilius Varus in Jerusalem in 7 AD as a result of a rebellion. So that might be why Pilate brought out the insurrectionist as a potential switch for Jesus. And we also know that when Jerusalem was destroyed in the revolt in 70 AD, that for months afterward, up to 500 people per day were crucified by Titus. So this was an attempt by the Romans to dissuade people from doing similar actions. Right? You hang someone in the most humiliating, painful way possible as a warning sign to others that they should not do this. There's no interest at all in humane punishment. This was entirely about humiliation and cowering enemies, cowering those who would rebel against Rome. Here's a few drawings of what this would have looked like. The patibulum is the cross beam that would have been carried to the place of crucifixion. The body would have been, the arms would have been placed on this and then hauled up to the on a spike that would have been in the ground already. So when it says in verse 22, they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. But this would have been a known spot. There would have been, these poles in the ground, and this would have been where Romans would have crucified people. It would have been like having gallows outside of prison. This is where you execute prisoners. Same concept. And so, it's pretty likely that the spot identified today as the place where Jesus was crucified at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem today, we know that was outside the Roman walls at the time. We know that it was on a hill, which makes sense, and we know that it was on a road outside of the city. So it's very likely. I don't see any reason to think it's not the place that Jesus was actually crucified. There would have been a written charge that the crucified person would have worn around their neck on the way to the cross, which would have said, King of the Jews in this case. And we see this in verse 26. The inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. So again, Pilate is being mocking, but he's also being accurate. That's the charge. That's what's hanging there. And so you see, it would have been in Latin, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. And in stained glass windows, you sometimes see INRI. That's the first letter of each of those words, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. Might have also been in Hebrew and in Greek as well. I think John's Gospel records that. But here again, Mark just records the charge. You've got the robbers on the right and the left, and you've got the further mockery in verse 29. Just to emphasize, though, the details of what Mark picks up on in the mockery and the way he describes the crucifixion. So again, verse 26, he's King of the Jews. In verse 32, the mockery, let the Christ, let the Messiah, in a mocking way, the King of the Jews, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. I'll come back to that word see in a minute. The other mockery is about the temple. So destroy the temple, aha, you who said, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. So again, why does Mark highlight that theme? We've seen the temple be the central conflict point ever since Jesus came into Jerusalem. We had the cleansing of the temple, we had the debates in the temple courtyards, we had the prediction of the destruction of the temple, we had the charges against Jesus and the Sanhedrin be about this, destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. They got it. They got what Jesus was teaching, that the place to find God is in a person. The place to find God is in the Son of God hanging on a cross. It's not in a temple. It's not in a space. It's not in a location. It's in a person. So Mark is juxtaposing. He's laying side by side temple, Jesus. And Jesus is the one who remains. The temple is destroyed and replaced. Who is this man? He's the Son of God. He is the one who has come to save his people, himself, in his suffering and death and resurrection. It's not the temple, it's not a place, it's Jesus himself. When we get to verse 33, the focus changes. From verse 1 to verse 32 of chapter 15, Jesus is being acted on. He is passive. Things are happening to him. He is being asked questions. He is being mocked. He is being whipped. He is being made to carry his cross. He is crucified. But then in verse 33, Jesus takes over. He becomes the active agent. He takes control of the situation. So when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. 3 hours of darkness, which is why in many congregations there's the observance of the Triore, the 3 hours of devotion on Good Friday. It can be very moving to observe that. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, from Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's a reason he quotes that verse, as we'll see. So in the bystanders hearing it said, behold, he is calling Elijah. This echoes the John the Baptist language all the way back to chapter 1, where Elijah would be the prophet who is coming before the return of Yahweh to save his people. And John the Baptist shows up as Elijah, wearing camel's hair, preparing the way of the Lord. Someone brings a sponge of sour wine, gives it to him to drink. Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Again, this question of Jesus' identity. Verse 37, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And then bam, bam, bam. As soon as he breathes his last, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. Okay, so back to the darkness. In Exodus 32, Moses stretches out his hand toward heaven, and there was darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. That was a sign of judgment on Israel. Or sorry, a sign of judgment on Egypt. The plagues were now here. God was demanding that his people go, and he was come to save his people and execute judgment on the hardened heart of Pharaoh and his people. We also have this anticipated in Mark chapter 13, as you recall. In those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Here we have the sun being darkened as the Son of God is dying on the cross. So Jesus is fulfilling what he said would happen. All these things would take place. These stones would not be left one on another. Mark is kind of tying up the threads for us here at the conclusion of Jesus' life. The key phrase, though, is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it sounds like a cry of resignation. In fact, we usually call it a cry of abandonment, that Jesus is left alone on the cross, that God has deserted him. But is that what is really happening here? As we've seen before, whenever Jesus quotes a passage from the Old Testament, you got to go back and look at the Old Testament. So I invite you to flip back to Psalm 22, and I'll cherry pick some verses. My God, why have you forsaken me? So far from saving me, words of my groaning. The Hebrew there is actually doesn't include the verbs. It's kind of an emotive, right? So far from saving me. Words of my groaning. It's like you can't even put a complete sentence together. So great is his pain and suffering in verse 1. But you got to keep reading. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night I find no rest. Verse 6, I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. Sound familiar? All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. Almost exactly what you see in Mark 15. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Mockery. Verse 18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. For he has not, but, I should pause there. But it continues, verse 18. For he, God, has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but he has heard when he cried to him. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you, for kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. So it starts in Psalm 22 as a cry of abandonment and seeming rejection by God, is turned into God looking upon the afflicted one. And he hears his cry and brings him victory. All the families of the earth shall worship before him. And of course, what happens with Jesus? It appears that the crucifixion is the ultimate loss and failure. But God turns it into the ultimate victory by his resurrection. You got to read Read to the end of the story. Psalm 22 is about God winning, even though it looks like complete failure. And so, as soon as Jesus breathes his last, we get two, let's call them victory laps. Two very brief but very important events occur immediately. First, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, we don't know which one. Solomon's temple had doors. In the Herodian temple, there were two curtains. We don't know which one. It kind of doesn't matter. But recall in verse 30, in chapter 13, verse 2, do you see these great buildings? In no way will stone be left on stone, which is not thrown down. Right? That temple is going to go away, Jesus said. In 1458, right? We heard him saying that he will tear down this temple made by hands, and after 3 days, another not made by hands. Chapter 15:29 again. The one destroying the temple and building it up in 3 days, ha, ha, ha. And as soon as Jesus dies, what happens? The curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the detail of the direction is essential. The only other time that word torn open occurs in Mark's gospel is in chapter 1. And that's at the baptism of Jesus. John baptizes Jesus in the Jordan River, and as he comes up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens torn open and the Spirit descending into him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." As soon as he breathes his last, the curtain of the temple is torn open from top to bottom. That is, it didn't happen from anybody on earth. It happened from heaven. God tore the temple curtain in two from top to bottom and revealed this man as his son. If you want to find God, it's not in the temple. He's hanging on a cross. I know it's commonly thought that, okay, the tearing of the curtain of the temple means that we have access to God and we can get into the temple directly without going through a priest. That's not what Mark is saying. Mark is saying that by this action, God is declaring him to be his son, that God is to be found on the cross. If you want to see God, if you want to be with God, you don't go to a place. You go to a person, to Jesus. That's the first victory lap. Second victory lap. Second victory lap is the Centurion. Here again, we have a random character out of nowhere who gets Jesus exactly right. So, verse 39, when the centurion who stood facing him, and again, notice how detailed Mark is on this. He's not, randomly looking around. He's watching Jesus. He's seeing Jesus. When he saw how in this way, he breathed his last with the cry of dereliction, cry of abandonment, the darkness for 3 hours, the uttering the loud cry. When he saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So finally, someone understands who Jesus is when he dies on the cross. Nobody for 15 chapters has correctly answered the question, who is this man? Now, this question has been asked. Oh, sorry, let's get the centurion onto the map of people who are following Jesus. But here's the questions that have been asked. 441, when Jesus calms the storm, the disciples ask, "Who is this man that even the wind and the sea are obedient to him?" They don't answer it. 614, Herod the Great heard about Jesus, for his name became evident, and they kept on saying that John the Baptist is raised from the dead. Is that who Jesus is? Chapter 8, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And then he finally says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." And Jesus rebukes Peter because Jesus, if you go back to chapter 8, didn't think that the Christ was supposed to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die. Yet what does the Christ do? He goes to Jerusalem to suffer and die because he is the Son of God. He is God come to save and rescue his people in his person, literally in his body. Now, Mark, the gospel writer, has already told us the answers, right? In 1:1, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, in the very first verse, right? In 1:11, the voice from heaven said, "You are my son." At 9:7, at the transfiguration, the voice from heaven, "This is my beloved son." But no human character in the gospel says correctly that Jesus is the Son of God until he is hanging dead on a cross. And that person happens to be a Roman centurion, probably who a few verses earlier was mocking or whipping Jesus. When he saw that in this way he died, he could only say this man was the Son of God. He goes from cursing Jesus, mocking Jesus, to acknowledging who he is, the only person in the entire gospel to get it right. And it's only when he's hanging dead on a cross. So Jesus is revealed as Son of God, not in casting out demons, not in walking on water, not in feeding 5,000, not in the praise of crowds. Those are all a foretaste. Those are all examples of the fact that he is God, but nobody in the gospel gets the right answer until they see him dead on the cross. And that's how we know God. We know God not from figuring it out, not from having it proven to us or some kind of a logical argument, not by feeling close to God, not by anything other than seeing Jesus on the cross for us, the Son of God who died for us. Now, Mark doesn't go into the theological details here. For that, we have to go to the Pauline epistles. For example, 2 Corinthians 5. We implore you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him who knew no sin. He made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might be the righteousness of God. So again, that theme of being cursed because he's on a tree. God made him sin so that we might become the righteousness of God. Or Galatians 3, I mentioned this verse earlier. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." Or Colossians 2. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. And Jesus himself foreshadowed this the very verse before he heads to Jerusalem. In Mark 10:45, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, as a payment for many, for us. So I'll stop here. And as you go through Holy Week and read through the events of that week again in your devotions, worship with the people of God, reflect on the suffering and death of Jesus culminating on Good Friday, remember that this is for you, that Jesus revealed himself as a Son of God who knew no sin, to be God, and sacrifice himself as a ransom for us, solely because he loved us. In Mark's gospel, he said 3 times that he would do this, and he was faithful. He accomplished his work for us. And it's only there. It's only there that we understand who Jesus is and exactly how much he loves us, even to the point of death, even death on a cross. So, one more prediction fulfilled. Remember the woman in 14:8 who anointed Jesus for burial? You can tick that box off now. We have 2 boxes left. I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. And then that strange little promise in 14:28. After I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. That's where the disciples and we get new life. So we'll get this next week. Thanks. Blessings on your observance of Holy Week and celebration of Easter. We'll wrap up next week with one last session on Mark 16.